The Netflix documentary exploded overnight. Headlines, clips, timelines, everyone thought they'd finally seen everything. Then 50 Cent said there was more. Behind the scenes footage. Raw hours that never made it to air. I know, because I was there when it was reviewed. Not as a witness, as the editor. What we watched wasn't chaos or panic. It was preparation. A man moving calmly, bargaining, rehearsing, surviving. And the longer I sat with that footage, the more I realized the real question wasn't what he'd done. It was what kind of person could watch it all and still help it disappear. I left my apartment before the sun came up. That was intentional. I like starting work days before the city remembers itself, before traffic learns its habits, before people rehearse their faces. The freeway was mostly empty, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts sound louder than they are. My dashboard clock glowed an unconvincing blue. I turned the radio off halfway through a sentence I didn't want to finish hearing. I've spent most of my life working behind glass, control rooms, editing bays, places where other people's voices come in hot and leave clean. I learned early that my job wasn't to add anything, only to remove what didn't belong. Noise, gaps, hesitation. You'd be surprised how much of the world runs on that logic. Take out the pauses, smooth the edges, and suddenly nothing sounds wrong anymore. I grew up watching powerful men land on their feet, not because they were innocent, because they were prepared. Where I'm from, everyone knows the difference. You don't need conspiracy theories to understand it. You just need time and attention. That's why I took the call. The address 50 Cent sent wasn't flashy. No gate, no sign, just a quiet building tucked where it didn't need to explain itself. I parked, sat for a moment, and noticed my hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else. He greeted me with a nod. No speech, no energy wasted. Curtis didn't shake my hand right away. He looked at me first, like he was checking alignment, not character. Then he stepped aside and let me in. The room we worked in was plain. Desk, monitors, drives stacked neatly, labeled in ways that meant something only if you already knew what to look for. There were no posters on the wall, no reminders of who he was to the outside world. Inside that room, he was just another man watching carefully. "We start at the beginning," he said. Then after a beat, "Don't skip the silence." That was it. He didn't tell me what he thought the footage would show. He didn't tell me what he wanted done with it. He didn't even tell me how much time I had, just pointed to the drives. 140 hours, raw, unreleased. Behind the scenes in the truest sense, angles meant for no one, moments that existed only because the camera hadn't been turned off yet. I sat down, slid on the headphones, mounted the first drive. The opening files were messy, date stamps out of order, audio peaking in places it shouldn't, conversations starting late, ending early. The kind of material editors usually hate, the kind you're tempted to clean before you understand it. I didn't. The first few hours were dull. That's important to say. No shouting, no explosions, just rooms, waiting, phones buzzing and being ignored, people standing too close to power without touching it. If I'd been alone, I might have started trimming already, habit taking over. But Curtis stayed behind me, arms folded, watching the waveforms like they were telling him something he didn't want to miss. I noticed something by the third hour. Not content, structure. The same phrases showed up in different files days apart, spoken the same way, the same pauses, the same half smiles at the end of sentences that didn't sound like jokes. It wasn't rehearsed exactly. It was practiced. Bad news arrived quietly in these clips. Legal updates, rumors, numbers that should have caused reactions. Instead, they landed and were absorbed. Plans adjusted. Calls made. Nothing broke stride. I rewound a section twice without realizing I had. Curtis leaned forward slightly. "Mark that," he said. I did. As the hours stacked, the footage stopped feeling like documentation. It felt like maintenance. People moved in and out of rooms the way you'd expect in a system that knew itself well. Voices lowered automatically when certain names were mentioned, raised again when they weren't. I started noticing where the cameras were placed, not just what they showed, but what they missed. Corners that never quite came into frame, doors that closed just early enough, angles that favored calm over consequence. At some point, Curtis left the room, not abruptly, just gone when I turned around. I kept watching. That's when the strangest thing happened. I stopped waiting for something to happen. I wasn't looking for a moment anymore. I was watching flow. How pressure entered a space and left it unchanged. How people adapted their tone depending on who was nearest. How certain conversations always ended with someone else agreeing to handle it. By the time Curtis came back, the sun was fully up outside. I hadn't noticed it rise. "How far?" he asked. "About 9 hours," I said. He nodded. Like that was enough. I saved my markers, backed up the drive, labeled the folder carefully. For the first time that morning, I understood the scope of what we were doing. Not exposing anything. Not yet. Learning how it worked. And somewhere in that realization, without ceremony or warning, the job stopped feeling neutral. By the second morning, the footage had settled into a rhythm. That was the first thing that bothered me. Not anything I saw, but how quickly my mind adapted to it. I came in early again. Curtis was already there, standing where he'd been the day before, like he hadn't moved at all. He didn't ask what I'd found. He didn't ask what I thought. He just nodded toward the chair. The files picked up where I'd left off. Different rooms, different days, same atmosphere. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, just controlled. People waiting without looking impatient. Phones face down. Conversations that stopped cleanly when someone entered, then resumed exactly where they'd left off when the door closed again. At first, it all felt forgettable. That was the danger of it. If this had been a movie, I would have been waiting for a spike. Raised voices, slammed doors, someone losing control. None of that happened. Instead, everything moved with the ease of something well practiced. I noticed the phrases before I noticed the faces. Certain sentences came back again and again, sometimes days apart, sometimes spoken by different people in different rooms. The wording never changed much. The tone never did. Even the pauses landed in the same places, like commas memorized instead of felt. It wasn't scripted, it was rehearsed. Bad news arrived quietly. A legal update mentioned in passing. A rumor framed as background noise. Numbers spoken without emphasis, like weather. Each time I expected a reaction, some tightening of posture, a raised voice, a sign that the situation had shifted. Instead, the room absorbed it. Someone nodded. Someone else made a note. A call was placed. The conversation moved on. Curtis leaned in once, close enough that I could feel his presence without looking at him. He watched the wave form, not the faces. When the audio dipped, when there was a stretch of silence long enough to feel intentional, he tapped the desk. "Back it up," he said. I did, twice. The silence stayed. As the hours passed, I stopped thinking of the footage as individual moments. It started behaving like a system. People entered and exited rooms the way parts moved through a machine. Voices dropped automatically when certain names came up, rose again when they didn't. It happened so consistently I could predict it before it occurred. That scared me more than anything I'd seen so far. I began paying attention to the cameras themselves, where they were mounted, what they favored, what they avoided. Some corners never came into frame. Some doors always closed just a second too early. There were angles that kept conversations centered, and others that seemed designed to drift away at exactly the wrong moment. It didn't feel accidental. It felt like someone had learned the limits of observation and stayed just inside them. At one point, Curtis left the room. I didn't hear him go. I only noticed because his reflection disappeared from the monitor. I considered pausing the footage. Instead, I let it run. That's when I realized I'd stopped waiting for something to happen. I wasn't watching for a reveal anymore. I was watching movement. How pressure entered a space and left it unchanged. How tone adjusted depending on who was present. How certain problems were never solved, only redirected. Conversations ended the same way over and over, with someone else agreeing to handle it, to make it go away, to smooth it out. There was a clip I rewound 3 times without meaning to. The content itself was unremarkable. A short exchange. A quiet agreement. What pulled me back was how easy it looked. No tension, no negotiation, just alignment. I marked it. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to cast a thin line of light across the floor. I hadn't noticed it move. Curtis came back in, glanced at the monitors, then at the markers stacked along the timeline. "How far?" he asked. "About 18 hours total," I said. He nodded. Again, like that was enough. We didn't talk about what we were seeing. We didn't need to. The patterns were doing their own explaining. I saved my work carefully, labeled the folders the way I always did. Neutral, descriptive, clean. My hands moved without hesitation. That surprised me. I was already treating this like any other job. As I shut down the system for the day, one thought surfaced and stayed with me longer than the rest. This footage wasn't documenting chaos. It wasn't even documenting control. It was documenting familiarity. Everyone in those rooms knew how things worked. They knew when to speak, when to wait, when to leave. I walked out into the afternoon light with that realization settling uncomfortably into place. Whatever this was, it wasn't unraveling. It was functioning. By the time we crossed into the 3rd day, I stopped checking the clock. Not because I was busy, because time had flattened out. The footage didn't move forward the way stories usually do. It circled, returned, reappeared wearing different dates. Curtis stayed mostly quiet. When he spoke, it was never about what someone said. It was about when they said it. Who was in the room? Who wasn't? He treated the footage like a map, not a confession. That's when I stopped thinking of what we were watching as behavior. It was operation. The behind-the-scenes clips involving Diddy were the calmest. That should have been the first real warning. No frantic pacing, no defensive posture. He sat the same way no matter what room he was in. Private offices, back rooms, temporary spaces meant to feel informal. Shoulders relaxed, hands open. His voice stayed level, even when the subject shouldn't have allowed that kind of calm. People leaned toward him when they spoke, not consciously. It just happened. The way bodies moved toward heat. The deals didn't sound like deals. They sounded like favors remembered out loud. A name mentioned, a pause, a nod. Someone saying, "That's already taken care of," before the question was fully asked. I kept waiting to hear a line crossed, a moment where it became undeniable. Instead, everything stayed just on the right side of casual. That's when the snake image entered my head, uninvited, not striking, not hissing, just moving. The footage showed him changing tone depending on who was closest to power in the room. Around lawyers, he was precise. Around executives, reassuring. Around people with less leverage, warm, not fake, adaptive. He never contradicted himself because he never committed to anything that couldn't slide. Curtis asked me to rewind one clip 3 times. It was a short exchange, barely 30 seconds. Someone mentioned pressure coming from outside. Diddy listened, nodded once, said, "That won't stick." No explanation, no bravado, just certainty. I watched it again and again. There was no tension in his voice because he wasn't reacting. He was recalling something, a precedent, a prior outcome. This wasn't optimism. It was memory. Religious language started appearing more often the deeper we went. Not sermons, not prayers, just references. God mentioned the way people mention weather, something external, useful, occasionally inconvenient. Morality framed as optics, as positioning, as timing. In one clip, someone else used the word accountability. It landed flat. No one responded to it directly. The conversation simply bent around it and continued, unchanged. Curtis didn't comment. He marked the time code. By then, I'd stopped writing notes about content. I was tracking patterns, sequences, the order in which people entered rooms, who spoke first, who ended conversations without appearing to. The scariest realization came quietly. I could predict outcomes before they happened, not specifics, direction. When pressure entered a space, it never stayed there. It was redirected, passed to someone else, deferred, absorbed into process. There was always another layer, another meeting, another voice that didn't need to be recorded. I noticed how often cameras drifted away just before those moments, how conversations shifted physically toward blind spots without anyone acknowledging the movement. It felt like watching animals adjust to terrain they knew well. At some point, Curtis stepped behind me and rested his hand briefly on the back of my chair. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I understood what he was seeing matched what I was seeing. This wasn't about avoiding jail. This was about knowing the shape of the maze. By the end of the section we reviewed that day, I realized I hadn't heard Diddy raise his voice once, not in any clip, not even in moments that should have provoked something. Anger requires surprise, and nothing in this footage surprised him. When Curtis finally broke the silence, it was with a single sentence. "People think pressure makes cracks," he said. "It only shows you where the seams already are." He left the room after that. I sat there alone, watching a paused frame on the screen. Diddy mid-gesture, calm, present, completely unthreatened by the idea of consequence. That's when the truth settled in fully. We weren't watching a downfall. We were watching a habitat. And the longer I studied it, the clearer it became that survival here wasn't instinctual. It was learned. By the fourth day, I wasn't just watching the footage anymore. I was agreeing with it. That realization didn't arrive as alarm. It came as comfort. The footage started making sense in a way it hadn't before. Not as evidence, not as pattern, but as explanation. The calm stopped feeling suspicious. The repetition stopped feeling rehearsed. It began to feel reasonable. I noticed it first in how I described things to myself. He wasn't avoiding consequences. He was anticipating them. He wasn't deflecting. He was managing. He wasn't lying. He was choosing words carefully. Those were editorial thoughts. I recognized them. I'd use the same language on other projects. Corporate cleanups, crisis responses, post-event reconstructions, where no one wanted chaos preserved in its raw form. You shape the narrative so it reflects intention, not noise. I told myself that's all I was doing here. I started cutting with that intention in mind. Not aggressively, not dishonestly. I didn't remove events or dialogue. I just adjusted emphasis. I shortened pauses that made statements feel heavier than they needed to be. I trimmed reaction shots that invited suspicion. I reordered sequences so cause followed logic instead of discomfort. The footage began to feel fair. In one sequence, a legal update arrived. Quiet, restrained, handled the same way I'd seen dozens of others handled. In the raw cut, there was a long silence afterward, a weight to it. In my version, I shortened that silence just enough to keep the conversation moving. It didn't feel like manipulation, it felt like accuracy. I labeled the sequence refined. When I played it back, I felt something close to relief. The tension dissolved, the story aligned. The man on screen no longer looked like someone perpetually preparing for fallout. He looked like someone navigating complexity. I believed it. That should have scared me. Instead, it felt like clarity. Curtis noticed before I did. He didn't stop me while I worked. He never hovered. He let the edit exist long enough to become real. When he finally spoke, it wasn't accusatory. "Run that again," he said. I did. He watched without expression, no nods, no commentary. When it ended, he didn't ask what I'd changed. He asked something else. Why does it feel easier? I didn't answer right away. I was still inside the logic of the cut. Because it flows, I said. The raw version drags. It makes things feel worse than they are. Curtis turned to look at me fully for the first time that day. Worse than they are, he repeated. I realized then how far I'd gone. He stepped closer to the monitor and scrubbed back to the raw sequence. Let the silence play in full. Let the hesitation sit. Let the discomfort do its work. The room felt different immediately, heavier, less forgiving. That's silence, he said, pointing. That's where the truth is. I felt defensive, not emotionally, professionally. It's misleading, I said. It suggests guilt that isn't stated. Curtis didn't argue. That's what prolonged exposure does, he said. You sit with it long enough, you stop hearing what's there. You start hearing what helps you live with it. He paused, then added, it's like a frequency. You don't notice it changing you because it doesn't hurt. I stared at the screen. The refined cut still looked right to me. That was the problem. You're not lying, he continued. You're adapting. Same thing the footage shows him doing. Same thing everyone around him does. I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, but recognition. Curtis leaned against the desk. You watch this long enough, he said. You stop asking if something's wrong. You start asking how it fits. I looked back at my timeline, at the way I'd arranged the sequences, at how natural it felt now, how defensible, how clean. I didn't mean to, I started. I know, he said. That's why it works. He told me then what he'd seen before I ever arrived, how people who stayed close long enough began to echo the same language, how they didn't defend him outright, they reframed everything until defense wasn't necessary, how belief didn't come from loyalty, it came from exposure. Your brain wants coherence, he said. This footage offers it over and over. Eventually, you accept the version that hurts the least. I sat back, suddenly unsure which version of the footage I trusted. The raw felt cruel now. The refined felt fair. And that gap, that preference, terrified me. Curtis straightened. That's the effect, he said. You don't protect him by lying. You protect him by believing. He picked up his jacket and headed for the door. Undo the cut, he said, not turning back. Then step away. I watched him leave, listened to the door close. I hovered over the keyboard for a moment, a long one. I considered leaving the refined version in place. It felt justified, rational, humane even. I understood exactly why people around him never spoke up. I deleted nothing. But I did revert the cut. The raw silence returned. Heavy, unforgiving. I sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the screen, trying to remember when the footage stopped feeling like evidence and started feeling like explanation. That was when I understood the final part. The danger wasn't that I could edit the truth away. It was that, for a while, I didn't want to. Curtis came back near the end of the afternoon. No rush, no urgency. He stood where he always did, just behind the chair, eyes on the monitors like they were already finished speaking. That's enough, he said. Your work's done. There was no ceremony to it, no recap, no judgment. He didn't ask how I felt about what we'd seen or what I thought it meant. The statement wasn't a conclusion. It was a boundary. Professional. Clean. I nodded. Outwardly, I agreed. That was the job. Inside, something resisted. There were still drives on the desk, folders I hadn't opened, sequences I'd marked, but never aligned. Not because they were explosive, because they were incomplete. I had the sense that if I just stayed a little longer, if I looked from one more angle, the whole thing would settle into place. The way a puzzle does when you stop forcing it. Curtis sensed that hesitation. He always did. Careful, he said quietly. That feeling's how it starts. I didn't ask him to explain. I already knew what he meant. The footage didn't pull you forward with shock. It pulled you in with coherence. It offered answers in exchange for patience. The longer you stayed, the more reasonable everything sounded. He picked up his jacket. "You don't beat this by staring longer," he said. "You beat it by knowing when to stop." Then he was gone. I powered down the system slowly. Saved nothing new. Deleted nothing. The monitors dimmed, one by one, leaving the room with its original hum. Neutral. Innocent. Like nothing had happened there at all. As I walked out, I felt that pull again. Not panic, not fear. Curiosity. The same kind that makes people linger in conversations that should have ended. The same kind that keeps cameras rolling when they don't need to. Outside, the light had shifted. Late afternoon, edging toward evening. The building looked the same as it had when I arrived. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to pass without noticing. I paused at the door longer than I meant to. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how convincing calm can be, how easily preparation masquerades as innocence, how often we confuse familiarity with truth. The footage hadn't proven anything new about him. It had taught me something about proximity, about what happens when you spend enough time inside someone else's logic. I realized then why people who stay close never sound alarmed. They aren't lying. They aren't defending. They're explaining from the inside. And once you're inside, everything has a reason. I understood, too, why the urge to keep watching felt responsible, like diligence, like integrity. The system doesn't force belief. It rewards it, slowly, comfortably. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the desire to go back hadn't left me. That was the final lesson. Not that footage can be edited, not that truth can be softened, but that exposure itself can feel like understanding, and understanding can feel like permission. I didn't expose anything. I learned how people live with what they know. And if you've listened this far, you already understand why that matters. If this story made you pause, if it made you question how easily calm can be mistaken for truth, take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you think. If you want to hear more stories like this, told slowly and without spectacle, subscribe. And if any part of this felt uncomfortably familiar, leave a comment. I read them. We all do. Sometimes the most revealing footage isn't what's on the screen. It's what starts to feel reasonable once you've watched long enough.